Okay, so this revision video is on the cardiac cycle. So this will be a slightly different video to the usual ones. What we'll do is go through an explanation, and as we go through the explanation, I will ask you questions along the way. And so that's how we'll test your knowledge. But before we begin, what you should do is draw this graph. So what you'll do is draw the pressure lines as we go along. So pause and draw that graph, and then we'll go through the explanation. Okay, so we'll start with atrial systole. So before we start discussing this in more detail, there's a few important things just to talk about. So as you see here, I'm showing a diagram of the heart, and what I'm going to do is show this throughout the discussion of the events of the cardiac cycle. Just an important thing to remember here is that this is a cross section, and it's showing the right and left atria, the right and left ventricle, but we can only see in cross-section part of the pulmonary artery. The aorta obviously moves behind the pulmonary artery, and you can see those three branches coming off the aorta there. So when we're talking about these events, when we're talking about atrial contraction, we're talking about both atria. When we're talking about ventricle contraction, we're talking about both ventricles contracting. And when we're talking about blood moving into the aorta, we're also considering blood moving into the pulmonary artery. So all these events are happening together. I'm going to be referring to only the events on the left side of the heart for this graph. But just don't get confused at the fact that I am showing blood moving through the pulmonary artery. So that's blood moving from the right-hand side. So anything relating to events in the aorta you will see here in the pulmonary artery. I think it's useful to use a correct cross-section of the heart just so you get used to seeing that. The other thing to remember is that when pressure increases in any of the chambers, the volume is going to decrease. Really important thing to remember. So anytime there's a pressure increase, it means that the volume will decrease. Okay, so let's move on to the explanation. So here we're showing arterial systole. The atria are contracting, and as a consequence, the pressure is greater in the atria, and so blood is moving from the atria into the ventricles where there's a lower pressure. So we'll go to our graph. This first section is atrial systole, ventricular diastole, and I want you to begin by drawing the pressure curve for the left atrium. So do that now. Okay, so you should have this line. So the pressure is relatively small because the atrial walls are very thin. They only have to pump blood to the ventricles. And so next, what I'd like you to do is to plot the pressure curve at this stage for the ventricles. So do that now. Okay, so what you should have shown is this. The pressure mirrors that in the atria. And the next thing I'd like to do is tell me what key event is happening at this point between the atria and the ventricles. Decide that now. Okay, so the key thing here is that the pressure is greater in the atria than the ventricles, so the atrioventricular valves open. Now let's just look at this point, the pressure in the aorta. So just a reminder, obviously what we see here in our diagram is the pulmonary artery, but it's the same events that are happening in the aorta, remember. It's just that the aorta is going to be at a slightly higher pressure. So what I want you to do is plot the line for the pressure at this stage in the aorta. So do that now. Okay, so remember that the pressure in the aorta is quite high, much higher than at this stage than in either the atria or the ventricles. That's just slightly decreasing because there's no blood being pushed into the aorta at the moment at this stage. And obviously, because that pressure is higher in the aorta than in the left ventricle, the semilunar valves at this stage are closed. Okay, so that's the events, or the key events during atrial systole. So now we'll move on to the next stage. So now ventricular systole. So let's add that to our graph. So we've got a line to show this stage here, and we'll plot the pressure lines at this stage. So atria now in diastole, they're relaxed, and the ventricles are contracting in systole. So we'll show in the diagram, and you can see they're contracting, and blood is moving from a higher pressure in the ventricles to where there's a lower pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery. So what I'd like to do first is plot the line for the pressure change at this stage in the left ventricle. Okay, so the line you should have is this. There's this very big pressure increase in the ventricle over this stage. And then I'm showing a purple arrow. So what key event is happening when this pressure increases in the ventricle above the pressure in the atria at this point? Okay, so your answer should be that the atrioventricular valves close at this point. And then next I'd like to plot the pressure change in the aorta. So plot that now. So what you should have is this. The pressure in the aorta mirrors that in the ventricles. So obviously the ventricles are contracted, push blood at high pressure, and you see that pressure move to the aorta as well. And so this is the line at the bottom for what's next happening in the left atrium. And I want you to decide why that line looks like that. So there's a small increase. That's as a consequence of the AV valve shutting. But then that gradual increase in pressure in the atria, why is that happening? So your answer should be that there is blood now starting to move into the atria. So although they're relaxed, blood is starting to move in from the vena cava and pulmonary vein. So let's move on to the next stage, the final stage. And this is ventricular and atrial diastole. So the whole heart at this stage is in relaxation. So first thing I want you to do is to plot the pressure change at this point in the left ventricle. So you should be showing this. The pressure is starting to drop, and now I want you to plot to the pressure change in the aorta. So what you should see, or what you should have drawn, is this. So the ventricles have pushed the blood out at high pressure, and that obviously high pressure blood is transferred into the aorta. And so at this point, the pressure in the aorta is greater than in the ventricles, which are now relaxed. So I'm showing you an arrow here. What key event is happening here then as a consequence of that pressure change? So you should recognize that that is where the semilunar valves now close. So the semilunar valves close as a consequence of that increased pressure in the aorta compared to the left ventricle. And remember, these events are obviously mirrored in the right side as well. So the pressure in the pulmonary artery will be greater than in the right ventricle, so the semilunar valve there will also be closed. So now what I'd like you to do is to continue that line for the aorta. How is the pressure going to continue there? So now you should have drawn that. So that pressure gradually starts to reduce slightly. It remains at a high pressure, obviously because of the structure of the aorta, keeps it at that high pressure, and of the semilunar valve closing, but it's a slight reduction now since the ventricles are no longer contracting and sending high pressure blood into the aorta. So the next thing, please continue the graph for the left atrium. So what will the remainder of the graph look like for the left atrium? Plot that now. So you should have shown this, so that increase in pressure gradually increases and then there's a sudden drop and it levels off. So I want you to explain why that drop occurs, and I'm also giving you a purple arrow what key event is happening there as well. So what you should recognize is that the atrial pressure increases above the pressure in the ventricles, as you can see the lines cross there, and as a consequence that purple arrow indicates that the atrioventricular valves then open, and so as a consequence blood can then flow in, and that's why you see that drop in pressure in the atria, because that blood is then flowing into the ventricles. And finally, the last thing is to just finish that line for the left ventricle, so plot that line. Okay, so what you should show is that because blood's now flowing in to the ventricles from the atria, the pressure follows pretty much what the pressure is in the atria. So that's slight leveling off. And then the next stage is obviously back to the start. So now the whole cardiac cycle continues again. So we're back to atrial systole and you follow the graph through. So that is the cardiac cycle.